So here you go. Welcome and thank you. So the economist John Maynard Keynes once wrote, "Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back." I'm going to suggest that what is good for the economic goose is also good for a geopolitical gander. In particular, I will seek to show how the ideas of a Victorian geographer, Alfred Mckinder, were to have a profound impact on world events in the 20th century and have a renaissance today. Before we start, it might be helpful to define our terms and set some wider context. First then, what is geopolitics? In its broadest sense, geopolitics can be defined as the influence of geography upon politics, how distance, terrain, and climate affect the affairs of states. Put another way, geopolitics looks at how international affairs can be understood and interpreted through the prism of geographical factors, not just those physical realities of landscapes, such as topography and waterways, but also aspects such as climate, demography, culture, and the availability of resources. It is the geographical stage upon which states strut and fret their hour. As Tim Marshall in his book, Prisons of Geography suggests, it was because of geography, for example, that Athens was a thalassocracy, a sea empire, whereas Sparta was a land power. 18th century Britain, as an island, enjoyed the freedom of the seas. 18th century Prussia was ringed by foes on all sides. One of the US's current great advantages is that, in contrast to Prussia then, or Russia today, it has no great powers on its borders. As Marshall suggests, these physical realities that underpin national and international politics are too often disregarded, both in writing about history and in contemporary reporting of world affairs. In this way, I suppose I'm reminded when watching news bulletins or reading newspaper headlines of the words of James Joyce, when he likened the news to an alien bag of wind, loud, disturbing, and ultimately transient, unable to acknowledge those deeper, slower, and less fundamental, sensational drivers of world events. Geography is then a fundamental part of why as well as what. In saying this, however, one risks the opposing danger of ascribing too great an emphasis on certain geographical factors and of thereby becoming too crudely environmentally deterministic, as was the case in the early 20th century. For example, the simplistic picture book story that the wealth and power of the global north is a product of those traits of hardy industriousness, resourcefulness, and tenacity necessary for survival in colder climates, with indigence rising in proximity to the equator for those very same reasons. It is perhaps easy to see how these easily digested childlike views were the ready bedfellows of the racist ideologies and social Darwinism which underscored the imperial mindset. Yet, as I will go on to suggest, this reminder of geography being far more than a footnote in human affairs is arguably more important than ever in a world of jostling states, contesting its finite and ever diminishing resources. Geopolitics has been described, amongst other things, as a slippery term, in that while it might be regarded as referring to the varied geographical factors that influence international relations, it has also been used to infer hard-headed realpolitik approaches to world affairs. A global perspective concentrated on territory, resource access, and strategic maneuvering, shorn of idealized understandings of what should be. As the political scientist Klaus Dodd suggests, geopolitics for many of its users was about being realistic, even cynical about states and the international system. Indeed, in its wider historical context, geopolitics as a field of study has been both loathed and lauded in equal measure. Lauded by those who hold it provides lasting geographical insights and reveals physical constants in the study of strategic relations. Loathed by those for whom geopolitics belongs to the dark arts of empire and tyranny. Its very DNA infused with the social Darwinism and nationalistic chauvinism within which it grew in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For example, lurking in the geopolitical family portrait, much like a disreputable uncle, we find classical geopolitical theorists such as the German writer Friedrich Ratzel, who expressed some of the dominant trends in that period, including racial and environmental determinism. Distinguishing between settled and nomadic communities, Ratzel argued that what he termed the settled Aryan peoples were vulnerable to the marauding peoples and tribes of the East. Ratzel contended that contemporary Germany should strive to secure additional land and resources so that it was better able to secure the survival of the nation state in the face of the more nomadic Eastern peoples. The Nazi concept of Lebensraum, living space, is particularly associated with the writings of Ratzel as a consequence of his interest in the interrelationship between the environment, state, and culture. Little wonder then that the American geographer Richard Hawthorne described geopolitics as an intellectual poison best avoided. Obviously, the aim here is not to endorse such worldviews, but to rather warn that it would be perilous not to reveal and acknowledge them, particularly when, arguably, many are becoming fashionable once more. In an age where the post-war rules-based system, largely decided and underwritten by US hegemony, dominance, is being challenged. Indeed, the signs are we are entering an age of renewed nationalism, economic crises, and great power rivalries, eerily reminiscent of an earlier age from which geopolitics arose. For example, a 2019 report by the World Economic Forum summarizes these changes as follows. It says, the world has moved into a new and unsettling geopolitical phase. It is not just multipolar, but multi-conceptual. There is no longer any assumption, as there has been in the past, that the norms and institutions exist towards which the world's major powers might converge. It goes on to say, this creates new risks and uncertainties, rising military tensions, economic and commercial disruptions, and destabilizing feedback loops between changing international relations and a country's domestic political conditions. In times of flux and uncertainty, there is a powerful tendency to seek reassurance in the past and to turn inwards. In this age of geopolitical upheaval, we are arguably witnessing powerful centripetal political forces at work, which are in contrast, and perhaps even in reaction to, decades of economic and technological centrifugalism, what some have called a contest between nationalism and globalism. The nation state, far from withering on the geopolitical vine, as some hyper-globalists have contended, instead offers governments and individuals an increasingly attractive anchor as the main source of power and legitimacy. In particular, nationalist agendas and the external projection of a strong state is often seen as an effective strategy for governments seeking to redress perceived humiliations, past or present. Nationalism is always premised upon some sense of real or perceived historical grievance. In China, for example, President Xi Jinping calls for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. He goes on to say, to put the country's century of humiliation firmly behind it. Or consider Donald Trump's promise to make America great again, after decades of being what he described as being taken advantage of. The twilight of the American dream viewed as an injustice. Or how about Vladimir Putin's nationalistic rhetoric and foreign policies seeking to reclaim what he regards as its rightful sphere of influence and rebuilding Russia's international status from the rubble of the Soviet Union? By the way, Putin is on record as saying the fall of the USSR was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. Variations on this nation-state-centered theme can be found around the world, but also closer to home. Think, for example, of some of the nationalist narratives and language around Brexit, e.g. take back control. These nationalist and strong state narratives are well-trodden and indeed well-marched geopolitical territory. In this brave new yet uncomfortably familiar world, some suggest that the strategic thinking of world power is once more being increasingly influenced by those long dead academic geopolitical scribblers whose dry whispers may linger yet in the corridors of the White House, the Kremlin, and increasingly their Chinese equivalent, Zhongnan High. One such lively ghost is Alfred Mckinder, the subject of our talk. As well as having a varied career, which included being a barrister and later MP for Glasgow, Mckinder, 1861 to 1947, played a lead role in the Royal Geographical Society. He helped champion the study of geography as an academic discipline and became the UK's first reader in geography at the University of Oxford, later director of the London School of Economics. Although he did not coin the term geopolitics, Mckinder nonetheless has a strong claim, amongst others, to being one of the founding fathers of the School of Geopolitics. Mckinder's geopolitical legacy rests upon ideas set out in a paper he first outlined to the RGS in 1904, in a paper called The Geographical Pivot of History. His central argument in the paper was that interior Asia and Eastern Europe, what he called the heartland, had become the strategic center of what he then referred to as the world island, as a result of the relative decline of sea power as against land power, and of the economic and industrial development of Russia at the time. He developed these ideas in a short book called Democratic Ideals and Reality, published early in 1919 during the Treaty of Versailles. They represented Mckinder's attempts to warn those present of the need to factor in how politics was shaped by land and sea if their agreed settlement were to last. Mckinder's prime concern was Great Britain and the British Empire. In many ways, he was typical of his time and an unabashed believer in empire. In this sense, geography's very own Kipling. Mindful of gathering imperial competition, Mckinder warned that traditional sea powers, such as Britain, were under threat from new land-based powers that might, with the help of new transport technologies such as the railway, be able to mobilize their populations and resources in a decisive manner. Mckinder spoke of the end of what he called the end of the age of the European discovery, what he called the Columbian Age, the period approximately dating from the 15th century into the 19th century. In its place, he talked of the rise of a post-Columbian age, which would emerge, and countries such as Great Britain would have to prepare for a dramatically new geopolitical reality. In particular, the rise of land power in Eurasia. The New World Order, he asserted, would present new challenges, opportunities, residing in the geographical pivot region of East Central Europe, Central Asia, and Russia. An area, as we know, Mckinder termed the heartland, the surrounding areas later called the rimland. In 1919, Mckinder expanded on this idea to warn of the tremendous resource and military potential of land-based countries such as Germany and Russia in comparison to maritime powers such as Great Britain and the USA. The advent of steam power, electricity, and railways was at last permitting continental nations to overcome the physical obstacles that had hampered their development in the past. This resulting growing land power would, he argued, erode the geopolitical advantages long enjoyed by the Western sea powers. The new great powers, such as the latter-day Soviet Union and China, would use the vast resources and strategic reach of the heartland to project their power across the European continent and beyond. A master plan, then, for world domination, which Mckinder famously summarized as thus: who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who commands the world island commands the world. In other words, their dominance of Eurasia, the Eurasian landmass, was seen as critical for global hegemony. And it's the theme we're going to come back to a little bit later on. In the context of the post-World War I, Mckinder feared that it would either be Germany or Russia, or maybe some future alliance of the two that might emerge as a global power, a global hegemon in charge of the resource-rich fortress of the heartland. To safeguard against this and preserve Western dominance, Mckinder suggested establishing a buffer belt of Eastern European states between Germany and Russia, as well as large-scale forced migration, moving Germans west from East Prussia whilst moving Poles east. In that way, removing Germany's enclave near Russia's border. As it was, Mckinder's proposals had little direct influence on the deliberations of the statesmen at Versailles, leading Mckinder to lament that democracy refuses to think strategically except in wartime. However, words last and words have power. Mckinder's heartland and pivot theory impacted another geographer, a German war veteran called Karl Haushofer. He was to use ideas of both Mckinder and Ratzel to formulate a strategy to end what he saw as German humiliation and to restore its geopolitical greatness. British imperialism was, for Haushofer, the greatest obstacle to German power. In one of his books included a world map showing a giant octopus located on the British Isles, with its tentacles stretching out into every corner of the globe. It's an image that will be used again and again, as we'll see, not necessarily about Britain. The development of German strength to counter the British and American maritime world, he argued, lay in the creation of a great Eurasian intercontinental power bloc with Russia and Japan, one in which Germany would be the senior partner. The rationale behind an alliance with Japan was to counter British and American naval power in the Pacific. As a lecturer in the University of Munich in 1919, Haushofer taught and profoundly influenced the thinking of Rudolf Hess, who would go on to become Hitler's deputy. Through Hess, Haushofer also had direct contact with and served as an advisor to Hitler. After the failure of the Nazi Beerhall Putsch in 1923, Hitler and Hess were imprisoned. As Hess's mentor, Haushofer frequently visited Hitler in prison, while the latter was dictating Mein Kampf to Hess. Many of Haushofer's ideas, including Lebensraum, would go on to be adopted by Hitler and incorporated into Mein Kampf. With the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Pact in 1939, Haushofer wrote, "Now finally, the collaboration of the Axis powers under the Far East stands distinctly before the German soul. At last, there is the hope of survival against the anaconda policy, the strangling encirclement of the Western democracies." This idea of encirclement, containment, is something we'll return to. It is only fair to say at this point that Mckinder was dismayed at the suggestion his ideas had been instrumental in Nazi plans for domination. Mckinder's ideas also had an influence on Nicholas Spikeman, an American political scientist. Spikeman wrote two major geopolitical works, America's Strategy in World Politics, 1942, completed just before the US entry into the Second World War, and The Geography of Peace in 1944. In the latter, Spikeman stated, "Geography is the most fundamental factor in foreign policy because it is the most permanent." However, Spikeman opposed a rimland thesis to Mckinder's Heartland doctrine, arguing that maritime Western powers should seek to control the coastal rimlands of Europe, the Middle East, and the East Asia Pacific Rim region, thus limiting the power of the Eurasian heartland. Spikeman argued that the United States should build North Atlantic and Trans-Pacific naval and air bases encircling Eurasia. Responding to Mckinder, Spikeman wrote, "If there is to be a slogan for the power politics of the old world, it must be, who controls the rimland rules Eurasia. Who rules Eurasia controls the destinies of the world." Spikeman insisted that US policy must be directed at the prevention of any such future hegemony of Eurasia, which he defined as a power position which would permit the domination of all within its reach. Spikeman's views were widely read in US policy circles, but in the 1940s, the term geopolitics, if not the concept itself, was increasingly regarded as off limits due to fears that had been raised in the US media about German geopolitical thinking and Haushofer's influence on Hitler. American articles and documentaries at the time warned of an Institute for Geopolitik with 1,000 scientists plotting Hitler's plan for destruction. A Frank Capra propaganda film exclaimed that Mckinder's mantra was a Hitler's step-by-step plan for world conquest. It would be a quarter of a century or more before the term would re-enter public discourse. Spikeman's rimlands concept is often seen as providing the intellectual background behind the post-war US policy of containment of the USSR and communist China. As mentioned, Mckinder was deeply upset by the suggestion he had been influential in Nazi geopolitical strategy. Towards the end of World War II, Mckinder, who was now well into his 80s, offered his ideas on how to contain a defeated Germany. To its west, he suggested there should be a bridgehead in France, a moated aerodrome in Britain, and a reserve of trained manpower, agriculture, and industries in the eastern United States and Canada. And to Germany's east, well, Mckinder said, if the Soviet Union emerges from this war as conqueror of Germany, she must rank as the greatest land power on the globe. By 1945, with Germany defeated, Mckinder's model foreshadowed the emerging East-West Cold War. American strategists such as George Kennan were heavily influenced by Mckinder's ideas in developing their policy of containing the USSR and communist China. Just days after Mckinder's death in 1947, President Truman successfully requested congressional backing to make containment US policy. For better or for worse, America's foreign policy and the global order it has championed to the present day are thus arguably steeped in Mckinder's fusion of democratic ideals and realpolitik. In this way, did Mckinder finally succeed in helping teach democracies to think strategically? Or was it simply a continuance of a global domination by any means in the form of US neo-imperialism? Indeed, the USSR at the time condemned the heartland and pivot theory as justifying what it called the aggressive policies of imperialist states. However, following the collapse of the USSR in around about 1991, Mckinder's ideas have found new and powerful audiences in Russia. In particular, the emphasis on the centrality of the heartland and its control by a land power in contention with Western maritime powers is one that is a prominent theme in contemporary Russian nationalistic thinking. In his book, Black Wind, White Snow, Charles Clover shows how the right-wing ideologue Alexander Dugin drew on Mckinder to cast Russia as the great Eurasian land power, eternally opposed to liberal Atlantic sea power. First in lectures to the General Staff Academy, then in a bestseller called The Foundations of Geopolitics. Dugin presented geopolitics as the secret reality of power behind the fakery of democratic ideals. As with Haushofer many years before, Dugin sees geopolitical conspiracy all around. Yet this time, the writhing and entangling tentacles are those of the US rather than Great Britain. Dugin's ideas about Russia's need to expand into Eurasia have, Clover argues, proved useful to the Kremlin. The Eurasian Economic Union, launched in 2015, embodies the idea of Russia reaching beyond national bounds. We might also reflect upon Russia's direct military involvement in Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria. Is the Ukraine, perhaps, the nearest equivalent today to Mckinder's proposition that he who rules Eastern Europe commands the heartland? If so, does this help explain the rivalry between Russia and the West over the geopolitical orientation of Ukraine? How might we also understand Russia's increased involvement in Syria and the wider Middle East? However, perhaps it is also worth sounding a note of caution in seeing all these events through this particular prism. Is there a danger here that as we geopolitically see, so we geopolitically are? Could these ideas provide a dangerous justification for extraterritorial aggression and new forms of imperialism? Whilst Russia directly and indirectly controls much of the heartland region, it is also some way off commanding the world island. To do so, it would have to contend with the other major Eurasian powers, not least of which is China. Back in 1904, Mckinder had also imagined the Chinese conquering Russia and adding an oceanic frontage to the resources of the great continent. Some recent commentators have also suggested Eurasia is gradually integrating and that China sees the whole supercontinent as its natural sphere of expansion. If Russia tilts towards Asia rather than Europe, China could become the hegemonic power in Eurasia and arguably beyond. Yet how likely is this? A key US strategic concern is that Russia will perform what it has referred to as a reverse Nixon. This refers to the possibility of Putin emulating US President Richard Nixon, whose groundbreaking 1972 Cold War outreach to China and ping-pong diplomacy tilted the strategic balance in America's favor. If Putin performed a reverse Nixon and played his own version of the China card, the world system and American influence in it would be upended in a new Eurasian dawn. Again, who does this remind you of? Indeed, it appears China and Russia agree on a whole range of issues, principally the obsolescence of liberal democracy and the attractions of authoritarian governance. When Putin hosted Xi Jinping in Moscow in 2019, they celebrated a 30% year-on-year increase in bilateral trade and signed various cooperation deals. Russia is selling China its latest weaponry, including ground-to-air missiles and jets, while the two recently conducted an unprecedented joint patrol of long-range bombers and spy planes. Bigger, more frequent joint military exercises are planned. matching their diplomatic coordination in the UN Security Council. Putin is also is said to have met Xi about 30 times since 2013. And Xi is reported to have called Putin his best and bosom friend. However, that Russia may bristle at becoming an increasingly junior partner in any such relationship cannot be understated or underestimated. Indeed, Russia will be mindful of the growing Chinese power on her borders and traditional spheres of influence in Central Asia and beyond. I think Mckinder would also have doubtless had much to say about China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. The Belt and Road Initiative represents a $1 trillion plan, which some have referred to as a Chinese Marshall Plan, a state-backed campaign for global dominance, a stimulus package for a slowing economy, and a massive marketing campaign for something that was already happening, Chinese investment around the world. In 2013, President Xi Jinping announced his grand plan to connect Asia, Africa, and Europe. Since then, the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, has become a broad catchphrase to describe almost all aspects of Chinese engagement in Eurasia, Africa, and beyond. Belt and Road, or Yidai Yilu, is a 21st century Silk Road made up of a belt of overland corridors and a maritime road of shipping lanes. From Southeast Asia to Eastern Europe and Africa, the Belt and Road Initiative includes 71 countries that account for half the world's population and a quarter of global GDP. Countries from Panama to Madagascar, South Africa to New Zealand have officially pledged support. The Belt and Road also means that Chinese firms are engaging in construction work across the globe on an unparalleled scale. Advocates say the Belt and Road Initiative brings huge economic opportunities for countries and much needed investment in infrastructure in many poorer parts of the world, especially Central Asia and parts of Africa. For China, it also affords a unique opportunity to boost its soft power and political ties overseas. For their part, critics expressed disquiet that China could use debt-trap diplomacy to extract strategic concessions, such as over territorial disputes in the South China Seas, or silence on human rights violations, for example, the Uyghur in Xinjiang. In 2011, China wrote off an undisclosed debt owed by Tajikistan in exchange for nearly 500 square kilometers of disputed territory. Fears, meanwhile, have been voiced that expanded Chinese commercial presence around the world will eventually lead to an expanded military presence. In recent years, China established its first overseas military base in Djibouti. Analysts say almost all the ports and other transport infrastructure being built can be dual use. Thus, a realpolitik, if not a geopolitical interpretation, might be if it can carry goods, it can carry troops and tanks. Belt and Road Initiative mega projects across Eurasia also rely heavily on the further development of major trans-Asian railways that bring to mind the following analysis from Mckinder's Heartland thesis 100 years before, where he said, transcontinental railways are now transmuting the conditions of land power, and nowhere can they have such effect as in the closed heartland of Eurasia. Is there then a correlation between Mckinder's ideas and the maritime and continental developments of the Belt and Road Initiative? If successful, China would be in a strong position to rule the heartland and challenge US dominance of the seas. Can a parallel be seen between the many Belt and Road initiatives, rail projects in Central Asia, the Middle East and Southeast Asia, and Mckinder's century-old theory, in which rail expansion of Russia is presented as a threat in terms of enabling a huge land-based power in the heartland? Will great power rivalry in the Eurasian heartland once more resurrect Mckinder's theories? But let us stop to pause, evaluate and ask, is there a danger here of a self-fulfilling prophecy? In seeking to interpret the world through the geopolitical prism of yesteryear, are we condemned to repeat the past? Mckinder's theories are criticized as being too materialistic and deterministic. Their emphasis on rail enabled land power and on sea power perhaps failed to take into account new technologies of power projection. For example, air power, missile technology. Another criticism is that it perhaps perceives the intentions of others as being primarily expansionist and imperialistic. In so doing, are we blinded to shared interests and potential win-win outcomes of multilateralism, and thereby locked instead into a destructive zero-sum nationalistic mindset and policies? Does Mckinder and his ilk provide madmen in authority with a ready-made master plan for madness and mayhem? Does the geopolitical worldview dehumanize us and encourage us to treat societies as the it rather than the them? Are we already detecting worrying levels of Russophobia and Sinophobia in our news and public discourse? These are uncomfortable thoughts, but as we edge once more towards a world of great power rivalry, these are perhaps thoughts that now, more than ever, require new thinking. To conclude, I turn once more to the words of John Maynard Keynes, and when he said, "The difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but escaping from the old ones." Thank you.
Good, thank you, David. I've just been allowed to be unmuted. Sorry about that awkward pause. David, thank you for that. It was every bit as stimulating as I knew it would be. I hear David talking a lot about geography at lunchtimes. Let me leave it at that. David, at the end, it was interesting. With 3 minutes to go, we had a question that came in, which you posed rhetorically right at the end. Which is this question of the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Now, I know you've already answered it in a broad academic overview sense, but what's your view? What is your view? So take the Belt and Road. Is your view that this is history repeating itself, a new 21st century colonialistic imperialism, or is it something very, very different? Go on. What's your answer?
I think it's interesting that I think there is a danger that if you see the world in this way, a kind of cynical, self-interested kind of way, then you kind of get what you give. And I suppose you could see initiatives like the Belt and Road through that kind of prism. Is it China expanding? Are they tentacles of power and future domination? And I mean, there's always that kind of that dimension to thinking, but I think it also represents huge opportunities for many of these impoverished countries. If you look at many parts of Africa, for example, people say, well, the Chinese investment there, it's very transactional. It doesn't take account of human rights abuses and so on. But the other argument is to say, well, after decades or more of Western-backed approaches, many of these countries remain wretchedly poor. And so, many turn around and say, perhaps there's time for something new. And so I guess China's approach, it seems to me, when I talk about China, is far more transactional on one level. However, I also think that that there is this paranoia amongst Chinese military thinkers anyway about the idea of encirclement, containment. And you look at the military base in Japan, South Korea, again, Afghanistan, indeed, and then going around, and Taiwan, of course. And so I think those who, want to edge America out of that dominant role in the Asia Pacific region, see it as crucial that China's able to break out of that containment, I think. So I think, that there is a danger that this does become a self-fulfilling prophecy. We start seeing the world in this way, and this is the world we'll get. And it's not the only way of organizing world affairs. And I think, the multilateralism, I guess one of the big differences, it seems to me also, is that I talked about it being eerily similar to the beginning of the 20th century, that these great power rivalry, economic crises and so on. But one of the big differences, I think, also though, and a source of hope, is that we have far more robust multilateral systems now. The League of Nations was quite a primitive attempt at an IPO, an international political response. But I think, if you look at it now, we have the architecture. So you have these, these networks of global cooperation. You have the mechanisms for multilateral cooperation in a way you didn't have, I think, at the turn of the 20th century. So, and I think there's still a commitment to that. Yes, you hear the nationalistic kind of rhetoric, but to what extent is that just rhetoric? And I guess in times of crisis, there is that kind of a tendency to perhaps, revert to the national. But when these crises pass, I wonder whether or not, we also realize there's more to be gained from a more multilateral and cooperative approach to affairs. And I guess, I'm which one a bit, but I suppose the other one for me also is it's about sovereignty, isn't it? But what do we mean by sovereignty? So, the whole nationalist thing is about being sovereign, self-government, self-control, self-determination. But you could argue that in a world, in an increasingly globalized world, a world where economies and societies increasingly plugged into each other, where does sovereignty actually really reside? And so I think these are quite interesting questions. So I suppose the long and short of it is that, yes, there is a danger that if you see the world in this way, and you then start planning and start acting in a way that country then thinks that you're thinking in that way, it does become almost a positive feedback loop and can lead to kind of these national chauvinisms and unilateral and bilateral bypassing of international systems which were designed, I guess, to promote peace after the Second World War.
Okay, and subsidiary to that, David, thanks for that. Looking at your map of the Belt and Road Initiative, I counted, I think, 4 pipelines coming out of Xinjiang province. Do you think it's any coincidence that there are 4 pipelines coming out of Xinjiang province and therefore important strategically, combined with the treatment of the Uyghurs at the moment? Or do you think that's a question of everyone's attention being on that anyway? So do you think they're connected?
Yeah, I mean, the whole region there is a contested region. Xinjiang, I was there years ago. It's a desert, right? A lot of it's desert, and it's a fascinating place. The Uyghur populations there, they're quite distinctive kind of peoples. But it's also very close to Kazakhstan, which has got one of the world's biggest natural gas reserves. And one of the reasons for the pipelines there isn't just about sending stuff out of China, it's about bringing gas into China. So, when we think about these pipelines and these roads, it's not just one-way traffic. And what you're seeing there, I think, is China's attempt to ensure its energy security. So China has relied heavily upon coal to fuel its industrialization, its breakneck industrialization. It doesn't have oil, or very much of it. And of course, if it relied upon oil, it would rely upon rely upon container ships. To rely upon container ships puts yourself at the mercy of the naval hegemon, which is America. So I think one of the answers to your question, Paul, is this, that, you look at those pipelines there, they're tapping into some of the largest natural gas reserves on the planet. And it's a way of ensuring China has energy security and doesn't rely upon, if you look carefully, doesn't rely upon this region here where the US has naval dominance.
Got you. Thank you for that, David. And I'm very aware, I'm going to cut you off quickly there. I'm very aware that I abused my position as chairing this by asking my own question when others have been coming in. So sorry about that. So having barged in, we've had two related questions, which is, there's your slide on the Belt and Road superhighway. How does the whole digital thing play into all that? Does it enhance it? Does it undermine it? Does it correspond? How about a digital superhighway?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I suppose it also shows the limitations of Mckinder's emphasis on this kind of physical manifestation of power, because again, it's technological advances, and in a modern age, it is increasingly about cyber capabilities. And you start thinking about Huawei, and you start thinking about the way in which a country like China are actually world leaders in some of these new technologies now. And within China itself, of course, it's got the Great Firewall, which is perhaps the world's biggest and most comprehensive attempt to regulate the internet. And so I think it plays a crucial role, because it's not about, increasingly it's not about, I suppose the wars of the future, it seems to me, or the conflicts of the future will be not just about sending tanks, really. It's probably going to be about crippling countries' infrastructure, and that will be through cyber attacks. And so dominance in these new realms of space and a cyber realm will be vital for any would-be contender, I think, any would-be hegemon. It's no good. I don't think increasingly it will be enough to have the biggest warships if those warships can be crippled with a touch of a button. And again, it's that paradox of complexity, isn't it? Increasingly advanced and interconnected societies have massive capabilities, but they also have massive systemic vulnerabilities. And so if you can hijack or damage them in terms of their digital and their cyber capabilities, you can effectively cripple them without launching a shot.
Well, speaking of which, so that leads on to another question that's come in that segues in very neatly. And I'll leave to one side whether we saw a dress rehearsal of that in Australia or not. I don't know these things. I don't know who's responsible for that recently. But what I will say is this. Here's the question. Is there any doubt that the 21st century will be dominated by China? Is there any doubt? I think that's a really good way of putting it. Does anybody doubt it? So in 70 years' time, David, does anyone doubt that the Chinese are going to be hegemonic?
No, I could talk about this forever, and I have talked about this forever, it seems. But I think, with China, it's a fascinating one. The narratives aren't there, and the narrative that you've picked up is, the narrative of the decline of the West, the rise of China, the China century. And it's got lots of evidence to it. If you look at the economic shift, the global shift in manufacturing, in economic power, and the fact that China's moved from being a low-cost manufacturing base to moving up the value chain to being a real contender in some of the most cutting-edge technologies, in a really short space of time. It's got enormous potential, and it's got enormous vision too. And I think what's really interesting is that early engagement with countries like China back in the 80s, the assumption in the West was, and I think a lot of it was like premature triumphalism, that the assumption in the West was, engage with these countries economically, and through the incorporation of increased market forces, you will trigger the inevitable evolution of liberal democracy in some form, e.g. a market democracy leads to industrialization, leads to urbanization, leads to an educated population that start moving through this Maslow hierarchy of needs, and then start demanding the right to vote and so on. And so the assumption was that, by engaging with them economically, you would be able to sow the seeds of democracy. But I guess a slightly more disquieting kind of vision is this, that maybe China, and especially China, has pioneered a new form of capitalism, a new form of possible authoritarian capitalism, which is far more capable and long-term in its perspective than the messy liberal democracies of the West. And you're seeing that played out, aren't you? I mean, I don't necessarily, and again, that could be a key weakness of the West. Our liberal democracies, look at the COVID outbreak, are they always fraught with division? Are they slow to respond and so on? And whereas, these countries like China steal a march, and they become this, they create this new paradigm of development, which countries rally to. But I don't know, I think that might be premature. I think there's powerful weaknesses in China too. One, of course, is that, you see this big monolithic entity, and that danger of seeing it, rather than them. But, you see this monolithic entity and you think, wow. But actually underneath that edifice, there are some massive fractures, it seems, environmentally, socially, politically. China also faces a demographic crisis. Some have described it as being the first country in history that will grow old before it grows rich. Again, one-child policy and so on. So it has some huge internal weaknesses. But then also, I think it's about external projection. That's trying to soft power. Okay, might say that America's taken America's soft power and image overseas has taken a hit in recent years. But at the same time, I think in terms of alliances, in terms of its kind of wider networks, the West, I'd say the West, I mean particularly America, shouldn't be discounted. I think that sometimes perhaps this is possibly premature. Who knows? I think, and also to what extent does China want this? And that's another point I come to again. We're talking as if they're, is it kind of a grand plan for world domination? But maybe China just wants to secure its own regional dominance. Perhaps China wants to edge out America from the Asia Pacific, secure its own regional dominance. And when I was out there years ago, I know the official party line was always about encouraging a multipolar world. So their official line, in their state-run media anyway, in academic circles, is to challenge what they regard as corrupting and dangerous US hegemony, and to replace that with a far fairer global multipolarity, i.e. the different regional powers. And if that's the case, that China isn't intent on world domination, China's intent on its own regional domination. But again, I think it's a hard one to see. And I think, that if you look at the West, it also has enormous strengths. You look at it and you see it as divided, chaotic, economic crisis. But actually from that, in the long term, and the one I've been thinking about recently, is that perhaps, in the long term, it leads to better decision making. So even though in the short term, it's racked with division and debate and paralysis, the HS2, it could be built tomorrow by China, it's taken years here. But, you might argue that's a powerful source of strength. You look at the pandemonium in American politics and, you think that these authoritarian states are making hay. But yeah, maybe. But then also perhaps that shows the strength of democracy, that you can remove people, you can remove these leaders in a way you can't in places like, China and Russia. So I'll answer your question, Paul, rambling a bit there.
No.
I personally think that China is seeking more regional dominance, almost certainly, wants to reclaim Taiwan. By reclaiming Taiwan, it will ensure its own security, but then also will dominate that Asia Pacific region. And beyond that, I don't know.
Thanks, David. There are loads of questions coming in, and we've already passed time. I mean, we really could be going. We could go on for another half an hour, but I want to keep to time and just limit myself to one more question. And my massive apologies for people who have asked questions which haven't yet been answered. There's a really interesting one here. Well, you answered in passing in what you described as rambling. I thought it was very analytical. You answered a question that came up about soft power, which is a really interesting point. Finally, then, how does Mr. Godwin see the distribution of COVID vaccines as being an extension of the geopolitics he describes in this lecture? So to what extent is there such a thing, for example, are we, in the UK, are we poised to get involved in vaccine imperialism? So how does COVID vaccines fit into all this? And I know there you go, it's 2:07. I've just thrown an interesting curveball in.
It's interesting, it's fascinating. I think, I mean, there's lots of talk of COVID nationalism too, isn't there? And I think it's quite, I was talking to the upper six earlier on today about this, it's quite a simple binary, I guess, thinking, but, it's a handy way of getting a purchase on this. But, you could talk about the idea of, this globalism, nationalism. And, when the going gets tough, do the tough get national? And if that's the case, then you've seen that with COVID, haven't you? Suddenly, you've seen it within the EU, you see it beyond, countries jockeying to secure to secure their supplies of vaccine. But then also, if you look at the headlines, that bag of wins again, you see people, almost like an Olympic sprint. We've vaccinated more people than you, that kind of thing. And so, I think there's elements of that. How long will that last? I don't know. I mean, lots have been made of the fact that things like COVID might herald an end of globalization and a retrenchment, and perhaps even deglobalization. But I guess I would argue, is that possible? Is that desirable? Unless you want to live, if you want to live, if you want to live in a kind of closed, insular society, and all the travails that entails, I think people want global connectivity, and I think that with the vaccine, yes, you could say in a short term, there's been that kind of nationalistic response, but arguably, you could also turn that around and say, well, actually, the development of the vaccine, the understanding and tracking of COVID has also been possible because of the multilateral systems I talked about, the WHO and so on. And also, I suppose in the short term, the going gets tough gets national. Okay, for immediate response, but that's not going to solve it in the long term. So perhaps in the long term, it might actually encourage, paradoxically, greater multilateralism, because that's the only way that you will be able to secure that win-win outcome with it. Because if one country vaccinates everybody, fine, but there'll always be another strain popping up somewhere. There'll always be another virus, an age of pandemics, they call it, don't they? Globalization. Those, I think the ex-head of the IMF talked about it as with globalization, global connectivity, those same channels of communication can become channels of contagion, but you still want the good stuff flowing. So I don't know, Paul. I kind of tend to think that actually, possibly in the short term, you're going to see spasms of nationalist reaction, but hopefully in the long term, it might actually enhance a different form of multilateralism. That's the hope anyway. But you never know.
David, I want to thank you massively for that talk. It's getting rave reviews coming in on WhatsApp. My phone's pinging away.
Oh, thank you.
Things about this talk, ladies and gentlemen. One, I knew David was going to be good. We have casual conversation about this sort of thing a lot. And two, I knew he was going to spend a lot of time talking about China. It's what he does, ladies and gentlemen. It's what he does, and he does it well. So I want to thank you, David. That was brilliant. What else can I say? Thank you to you all, ladies and gentlemen, for logging on. I've got to say, these EDTalks are really good. They're a wonderful, wonderful innovation. The next one is going to be, if you could make a note in your diaries, or a mental note at the very least, on Wednesday, the 21st of April, same time, and it's going to be delivered by Katrina McGrath. The title is yet to be finalized, but the subject area is chemistry. So we're moving on to straight science. So Katrina McGrath, chemistry teacher extraordinaire, on Wednesday, the 21st of April at 6 p.m. David, thank you for moving the bar even higher. Thank you, and thanks for coming along, ladies and gentlemen. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Paul.